Welcome to another episode where we look at history and culture through the lens of beer. Today we're looking at a really fascinating article. It's called Indians Are Drunks and Drinks Are Indian: Alcohol and Indigenismo in Guatemala, 1890-1940.
Yeah, it's quite a title, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it really gets to the heart of how something seemingly simple, like drinking habits, got tangled up with huge ideas about, well, national identity and progress in Guatemala during that period.
Absolutely. And it's kind of surprising how looking at beer or local brews like chicha can tell us so much about social attitudes and even government policies back then.
You really can. The paper uses all sorts of sources like writings from the time, newspaper articles, old laws, even court records dealing with alcohol cases.
So it paints a pretty detailed picture. And the goal here, I guess, is to unpack how drinking, specifically certain kinds of drinking, became so strongly linked with the idea of being Indian and what that meant for how people thought Guatemala was developing or not developing.
Exactly. And a key idea the article introduces right away is this concept called Indigenismo.
Right, Indigenismo. What exactly was that?
Well, simply put, it was this ideology found across Latin America that basically suggested, often quite negatively, that the large indigenous populations were somehow holding back national development.
Okay, so not a very positive viewpoint from the start. How did alcohol get dragged into this?
Well, some of the key thinkers associated with Indigenismo really zeroed in on alcohol. There was Antonio Batris Jauregui, who wrote a book back in 1894 called Los Indios, Su Historia y su Civilización.
What was his take?
He painted this picture of a, glorious ancient Maya civilization,
Uh-huh.
but then contrasted it sharply with the indigenous people of his own time, who he described as, well, suffering from indolence, drunkenness, ill health, ignorance, and poverty. Pretty damning stuff.
Definitely. And did he specifically mention types of alcohol?
He did. He pointed to chicha, that's the traditional maize beer, and aguardiente, which is a strong spirit made from sugar cane. He called them elements of destruction, poverty, and debasement.
Wow. Elements of destruction.
Yeah, and he even made this extraordinary claim that alcohol was responsible for more indigenous deaths than both wars and diseases combined.
That sounds incredibly extreme. Was that a common view?
It seems to have gained traction. Another figure, Miguel Angel Asturias, who later became a very famous writer, wrote something in 1923 called El Problema Social del Indio.
Okay.
And in it, he listed what he called the diagnostic pathogens of Indianness. And right at the top, underscored even, was alcoholism. He saw it as the main cause of their supposed degenerate defects.
So the connection is becoming really explicit there. Being a drunk was essentially the same as being Indian in this mindset.
That's exactly the argument the paper makes. The two ideas, drunkenness and Indianness, just became completely fused in this particular ideology.
Now, people were worried about excessive drinking before this period too, right? It wasn't totally new.
Oh, absolutely not. The article mentions an archbishop, Pedro Cortés y Larraz, complaining way back in 1779 about heavy drinking being a big issue for everyone, indigenous people and Ladinos alike.
And Ladinos are the non-indigenous population, often mixed heritage.
Correct. And even in the early 1800s, you had local officials worried about taverns and their impact. So concern about alcohol wasn't new.
So what really changed in the late 1800s, early 1900s? Why this intense focus on indigenous drinking?
That's where it gets interesting. You start seeing newspaper editorials framing drunkenness not just as a personal failing, but as a national problem, something holding Guatemala back. Francisco Javier Torres wrote in 1909 about alcohol being a pernicious and backward element.
But wasn't there a bit of a contradiction? Like, you'd see these editorials condemning drunkenness, but then advertisements for fancy imported wines or even those alcohol-based nerve tonics.
Exactly. And that highlights a crucial distinction they were making. It seems the concern wasn't really about the elites sipping their imported wines.
Okay.
The real problem, as they saw it, was the working class and particularly indigenous people drinking aguardiente. That specific type of drunkenness was framed as detrimental, as dangerous to progress.
So a clear class and ethnic dimension to it. It depended on who was drinking what.
Precisely. By 1919, things had escalated to the point where editorials in the Diario de Centro America were actually calling for prohibition, looking to the U.S. as a model.
Really? Full prohibition.
That was the call. And then, remember Miguel Angel Asturias? In 1926, he published a piece in the newspaper El Imparcial. The headline was, Denuncia de los estragos de alcoholismo entre los indios, basically condemning the devastation of alcoholism among indigenous people.
And the article we're discussing sees that as a key moment.
Yeah, it argues it was one of the first times this link was made so publicly and explicitly, suggesting essentially that chronic drunkenness was Indianness, regardless of your actual ethnic background. It cemented this stereotype.
So the stereotype, Indians are drunks, really starts solidifying. Did this translate into like legal action or changes in the justice system?
Well, remember Patrice Joregi back in 1894. He had already tried to link rising indigenous alcohol consumption to rising crime.
Even though the stats didn't necessarily show that, you mentioned Latinos were more represented in the crime stats.
Right. His claim didn't quite match the available data, but the idea persisted. Fast forward to 1931, there was a study by Juarez Munoz. It just flat out asserted, apparently without much critical examination, that alcohol caused 99% of crimes committed by indigenous people.
99%. Again, that sounds wildly exaggerated.
It really does. And the paper contrasts this with actual arrest records from Alta Verapaz in 1937. Those records show, yes, many indigenous people were arrested, and yes, like some Latinos arrested, many had been drinking. But there wasn't this simple, direct correlation the critics claimed between being drunk, being indigenous, and committing crimes.
So the reality was more complex than the stereotype allowed.
Much more complex. The article suggests that factors like poverty, the general hardship of life, and also the role alcohol played in traditional rituals likely played a part in alcohol-related issues in these communities. It wasn't some inherent ethnic trait.
You mentioned rituals. Tell us a bit more about that. Did alcohol have a traditional place?
Oh, yes. For centuries, various fermented drinks had important roles in Mesoamerican religious life. Sometimes getting intoxicated was even seen as a way to communicate with the divine, with the spiritual world.
And did the Spanish conquest change things?
It led to wider availability and use of alcohol, certainly. And it wasn't always just religious. The historian David McCreary, who the paper cites, points out that communal, sometimes ritualized drinking also had social and even economic functions within indigenous communities, like for celebrations or distributing surplus.
Okay, so it had a place. When did this traditional use start being viewed so negatively by the wider society, linking into this indigenismo idea?
The paper really connects the dots between the increased and perhaps more problematic alcohol use around the turn of the 20th century and the huge societal shifts happening because of the liberal reform, which started around 1871, and specifically the boom in coffee cultivation.
Coffee. How did coffee fuel drinking? That seems counterintuitive.
Well, the coffee fincas, the plantations, needed massive amounts of labor. This pushed many indigenous people into wage work, often seasonally.
Okay, so they started earning cash.
Right. And for many communities, having cash meant they could expand or more frequently practice their customs and traditions. And often, fulfilling those obligations involved buying alcohol, usually aguardiente, from Ladino vendors or taverns.
So wage labor ironically led to more spending on alcohol for traditional purposes.
In many cases, yes. Buying alcohol for ceremonies, festivals, or just personal use became one of the main ways cash flowed between the indigenous communities and the wider Ladino economy.
But wasn't there exploitation involved too?
Definitely. The paper mentions habitadores, these labor contractors who would often use alcohol, sometimes advancing it on credit along with debt, to recruit and control indigenous workers for the plantations. It was a pretty coercive system.
That sounds incredibly predatory.
It could be. There's a really telling quote in the paper from a coffee plantation owner, a finquero. He apparently said, "Take alcohol away from the Indian, and what becomes of coffee? Coffee plantations run on aguardiente as an automobile runs on gasoline."
Wow. That just lays it bare, doesn't it? The economic incentive behind keeping alcohol flowing, even while publicly condemning indigenous drinking.
It really does. It shows how intertwined the economic interests were with these racialized ideas about alcohol.
So given all this, what was the government actually doing? Were there laws about alcohol use?
There had been laws restricting indigenous alcohol consumption going way back, even to colonial times, but enforcement was often inconsistent, to say the least.
And didn't the government make money from alcohol itself?
That's the other crucial piece. Alcohol sales, through taxes and state monopolies on distillation, became a really important source of revenue for the Guatemalan state.
So they're condemning it on one hand, but profiting from it on the other.
Precisely. You see this with Juarez Munoz again in his 1931 study. He recommended various state actions to limit indigenous access to alcohol, things like restricting licenses for cantinas, regulating quality, limiting opening hours near indigenous towns.
But did he suggest the state stop taking the tax money?
Conspicuously, no.
Yeah.
He didn't suggest the state give up that revenue stream.
That's quite telling. Did the government take any action based on these ideas?
Well, they did start to crack down, particularly from 1931 onwards, on the illegal production of traditional homemade brews like chicha and another one called bouge.
Ah, so targeting the home brews specifically.
Yes, which led to a noticeable increase in arrests, especially in heavily indigenous areas. You can see it in the data presented in the paper.
So making your own traditional drink becomes criminalized, reinforcing that link between Indianness and illegal alcohol activity.
Exactly. It fit neatly into that Indigenista narrative. And things got stricter. By 1940, the Ministry of Agriculture and Hacienda issued an order outright prohibiting alcohol sales and even the fermentation of chicha anywhere near the coffee fincas.
Trying to control the labor force, presumably.
That seems a major motivation. You had newspaper editorials around that time describing these little informal drinking spots, chicherias, very negatively, linking them to disorder and inefficiency.
Was there any other thinking about how to address it besides just banning things?
There were some other ideas floated. An editorial in 1937 in El Liberal Progresista speculated that maybe wage increases were just leading to more drinking.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, and the suggested solutions were things like promoting wholesome sports, but also, more ominously, applying the vagrancy law to anyone inclined to the vice of alcoholism, maybe even drafting them into the army for discipline.
Using the vagrancy law against drinkers, that's intense.
It really shows the level of control being sought. And it all comes back to what the paper calls the double valence of alcohol for the powerful interests at the time.
Double valence, meaning
Meaning alcohol served two purposes for them. On one side, it generated significant state revenue through taxes and sales. On the other, it was seen as essential, as that Finquero quote showed, for controlling and mobilizing the indigenous labor force needed for the coffee economy.
So the whole discourse condemning indigenous drinking was, in a way, quite self-serving.
That's the strong implication. It justified control, provided revenue, and kept the economic engine running, all while blaming the victims of the system.
So wrapping this up, the key takeaway from this article seems to be how deeply the control and perception of alcohol got tangled up with racist ideas and economic needs in Guatemala during this period. It profoundly shaped how the indigenous population was seen and treated.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about individuals making choices about drinking. It was embedded in a much larger system of power, prejudice, and profit.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How something we might see as straightforward, like alcohol consumption, can become loaded with so much complex social and historical baggage. And maybe how echoes of those old narratives might still linger today in different contexts.
It's definitely food for thought. These historical patterns can be quite persistent.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening exploration. If you found this look into history, culture, and yes, even aguardiente interesting, please do hit that subscribe button so you can join us for our next look into the past.